Okay.
Um,
Yeah, I saw it's a large number. Well, look, Calvin, I see you're admitting people, so I'll go ahead and start, and we'll just let people join as they do come in. And it is already almost 5 after. So welcome everybody to this second talk of our seminar series for the semester. The Southeast Asia Research Center at the City University of Hong Kong. Welcome for joining. Welcome, and thanks for joining us. Before I introduce the speaker, I'd like to point out, and if some of you have been in the Zoom hearing while Elizabeth and I were chatting, it will be another speaker from the University of Sydney, and that's in 2 weeks' time on the 31st. Aim Sin Peng will be speaking about mapping hate speech and disinformation in social media in Southeast Asia. So our Sydney focus continues. We're very pleased to have AIM speak in 2 weeks, but for now we are indeed happy that Elizabeth Kramer could join us of the Southeast Asia Center, SSEAC. We're SEARC, a lot of EAs in there, SEAs, as you would expect with Southeast Asia, at the University of Sydney, one of the one of the largest Southeast Asia centers globally, if not the largest. Elizabeth is the deputy director of the aforementioned center, and she's also a honorary associate at the School of Languages and Culture at the University of Sydney. She began her career researching anti-corruptionism, but her research interests have since broadened. Of course, the issue of anti-corruption, for those of you following Indonesian politics, is a fascinating one itself. And she's been awarded research grants, prestigious research grants from the Asian Research Council, as well as the Department of Education and Training in Australia. She has published a monograph with Cornell that just came out this year called The Candidate's Dilemma, Anticorruptionism and Money Politics in Indonesian Elections. And I'm guessing her research, her talk rather today is related to that anyway, centering the individual in election campaigns and political storytelling, reflections on the candidate's dilemma, and doing political ethnography in Indonesia. Again, welcome, Elizabeth, and we're looking forward to your talk. The floor, or the Zoom space, is yours.
Thank you. And if you'll just give me an opportunity to share my screen. All right, hopefully you can see that. Yes?
We can, yes. It's
okay.
Very clear.
Excellent. So thank you for that introduction, Mark, and good afternoon, everybody. I should also thank Dr. Diego Fossati for inviting me to speak. I hear that he's joining us later, but I'm very honored to be speaking for SEARC today. Hopefully you'll find this presentation interesting, or at least amusing, for the next 45 minutes or so, and very happy to answer questions at the end. Before I begin though, as is customary here in Australia, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. That's where the University of Sydney Camperdown campus is located. So I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land and acknowledge the law of country of the land where I'm dialing in from today, and also to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that this is and always will be the land of the Indigenous Australians, the Aboriginals. So in this presentation today, what I'm going to be doing is talking quite a bit about the book that Mark has already mentioned, and reflecting on this idea of centering the individual in research about elections. So looking at individual experiences is one of the core themes of my book, The Candidate's Dilemma, which just came out earlier this year from Cornell University Press. So I'm going to be talking more though about the journey of writing this book and how it's shaped my thinking around research related to individuals and really centering them within this idea of political storytelling. So in some ways, this talk is about my journey as much as it is about the journey of the political candidates in Indonesia that I'll be discussing, but hopefully I'll be able to strike a good balance in talking about both. Just a little bit of structure, what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm starting out with the very beginning of this journey, which was my PhD. Maybe some of you are PhD students, so this might be helpful for you. But then going through some of the shifts in my thinking, and then sort of ending with reflections on myself and my positionality as a researcher conducting political ethnography in Indonesia. So to tell the story, I really need to start at the beginning. And the beginning of this journey was about 10 years ago in 2011, when I was in the first year of my PhD. So at that time, after a bit of soul searching, I decided that I wanted to go back to university and do a PhD. I'd always been very interested in elections and politics and corruption. But I suppose one of the secret underlying motivations of doing this PhD was I really wanted a reason to go back to Indonesia. Indonesia is where my mother is from. I spent a lot of my childhood there, but I had spent very little of my adulthood there. So with that underlying motivation, I crafted this research project based on wanting to learn more about how political campaigns were being executed in Indonesia in the lead up to the 2014 national legislative elections. And I was really interested in this question of how political parties and their candidates were thinking about and talking about corruption as a political issue, and how important they thought it was to be seen by voters and by the public as being clean, or bersih, as they say in Indonesian. So that was the idea that I had going into this project. My approach to collecting data was admittedly very much guided by opportunity, opportunistic meetings, access to politicians and political party members through friends, or friends of friends, or sometimes friends of friends of friends. A lot of luck thrown in there as well. And I was very fortunate to have a generous travel scholarship from the University of Sydney at that time that allowed me to live in Indonesia for almost 14 months without having to work, which was fantastic. That 14 months in Indonesia allowed me to do a lot of things. Firstly, it allowed me to contract typhoid, which put a bit of a dent in my plans. But I did recover from that. And as I was recovering and, regaining my energy and enthusiasm, I got back to that fieldwork hustle of trying to get interviews and talking to political parties and politicians. And I had the opportunity to meet a lot of very interesting characters who are involved in politics. And some of those interesting characters are on this slide. So this is from a rally that I attended, which was an anti-golput rally, or a rally to discourage people from forfeiting their vote or not using their vote. But, elections in Indonesia are generally quite vibrant affairs. There's a lot of color, there's a lot of costumes, there's a lot of rallies. So it's a really exciting time to be in Indonesia, actually, and particularly focusing on campaigns. So during this time, as I'm out doing my fieldwork and making these connections, I start to see the basis of my PhD forming. And I was taking a grounded approach to my research. So that was the methodological framework that I was working with. So I really felt like the more I could see, the more I could do, the easier it would be for me to connect dots and to sort of formulate my argument. So within that, I had been toying with the idea of doing a more intensive political ethnography to explore local campaigning and how corruption issues kind of factor in to those very localized campaigns that individuals undertake in their electoral districts. And I just happened to ask in one of the interviews that I was doing in Jakarta if the person who I had been talking to would mind if I came with them to their electoral district to observe some of their rallies and to follow them around for a few days or maybe a week. And I wasn't really sure how they would react to that request, but they were really enthusiastic about it, and they were, very welcoming and positive about the idea of me coming and following them for a period of time. They were making their first trip, I think, in a couple of weeks after our meeting. So they, said, if you can get yourself to the city, we can meet there and we can go into the electoral district together and you can, just observe. And so I did that. And when I came back to Jakarta after that experience, it seemed like a new opportunity and a new sort of research pathway was opening up. And I thought, it would be so interesting if I could compare a few different campaigns to see, how different is a campaign in one part of the country to another part of the country, or depending on whether the person is a man or a woman. All of these different ideas were kind of rolling around in my head. And so I did find a couple of other people to ask who also agreed. And with that, I was able to shape a project around these 3 candidates who allowed me to follow them basically in the 12 months leading up to the election day in 2014. And these candidates were in different parts of the country. So one was in Sumatra, one was in Sulawesi, and one was in Java. They had different ethnic backgrounds, they had different gender backgrounds. So it made for a really interesting sort of fertile comparison across these different experiences. And it was also a lot of fun going around to these different places and experiencing them through this lens of a campaign, which is, of course, very different to going to different parts of the country as a tourist. So I had this wonderful experience and opportunity during my PhD, but in retrospect, I didn't really capitalize on it in the actual PhD. So despite all of the wealth of observation, all of these personal conversations that I had during the campaigns, several months of being in these different parts of the country and observing, my PhD thesis actually was pretty, I guess I can say now, in retrospect, pretty bland. I wrote a thesis that was about political party campaigns, the use of anti-corruption rhetoric as a political symbol, particularly with emerging parties, so parties that were either running in their first election or their second election, and comparing the national campaign strategies to the strategies of candidates at the local level. And my ultimate conclusion was that the motivations and rationales that drive political party campaigns at the national level are very different to the motivations and rationales that drive individual campaigns. And I use this to explain the juxtaposition that we see in Indonesia of these very strong, powerful, and kind of flagrant anti-corruption claims that you see throughout elections, which coexist alongside this very normalized expectation of vote buying, usually in the form of cash transactions or distributing goods or undertaking projects and the like. So, upon reflection, it was a pretty straightforward PhD, not a very controversial argument to make. But I submitted it, my examiners were satisfied, and they awarded me my PhD. I'm making it sound very easy. At the time, it was, it felt it felt very difficult at the time, but this is all in retrospect. So I submitted my PhD, I passed, I was now a doctor. The next step was to redraft it and submit it to a publisher, hopefully to have it published as a book. And that's kind of where things start to get interesting for me and for, what happened in terms of the creation of the book that has just come out this year. So it took me 2 years to write the first monograph. I had all of those other niggling concerns, like finding a job after I got my PhD. And, even though the first iteration of the book, the draft monograph, was quite close to my PhD thesis, it still took a bit of time to reshape it, to think about the chapters more as a book rather than as a thesis. So I was doing that while working. And I finished it, I submitted it to Cornell, who'd been quite positive about my book proposal, and then waited several months to hear back from the editor about the feedback from the academic reviewers. To cut a long story short, as an emoji, is pretty clear, it was not great. The feedback was pretty brutal. Some of the feedback that I received on that draft was that my book was overly theoretical. It was hard to connect with. The reviewers questioned the innovativeness of my arguments. They didn't think that it brought enough new insight to the topic of electoral politics in Indonesia, so that draft was rejected. But, and I will forever be grateful for this, the editor at Cornell University Press, Sarah Grossman, saw something in the book and she gave me some advice. And that advice was essentially that there are some really interesting stories in this manuscript, but they're completely obscured by all of these other things that you're trying to do with the book. So if you can draw out those individual stories, make them the focus of the book, it will be a much more interesting read and it will be much more viable for us to publish. And she said to me, if you do that, I would be willing to look at a second version of this monograph. So, even though I had been completely rejected and my work had been trashed, I had this, little kernel of hope going forward. So I set about rewriting the manuscript again, this time with the candidates and their experiences at the center. And that was the genesis of the second draft of the monograph and the book that was published this year. So I had several pages of negative feedback to go through from those initial academic reviewers, and also some encouraging words from the editor at Cornell. And, with that, I embarked on this pivot. Of course, I was really disappointed at the time because I had hoped that the book would be published a lot sooner. I was still looking for work. I didn't have a permanent position. I was really wanting to get my CV up so I could be competitive on the job market. But, again, in retrospect, it ended up being a real blessing in disguise to have this this opportunity to rework and to rethink the data that I had collected throughout my PhD. Apart from this sort of, opportunity to rethink, there are a couple of other benefits to this reframing. I do think that the individual lens is more engaging for readers and provides more of an opportunity for them to connect with the case studies. It was a more novel approach, especially since in the time between my thesis being submitted and sort of 2019, there were two really excellent academic books that had come out about the 2014 election. One from Ed Aspinall and Ward Berenschot, and the other one from Burhanuddin Muhtadi. Highly recommended, both of them. And finally, it was also an opportunity for me to think about and to challenge some stereotypes, particularly when it comes to political candidates in Indonesia. There are so many narratives about candidates, about vote buying, about clientelism. And of course, vote buying and clientelism are very real phenomena that candidates have to address. But, there are questions about how do these phenomena affect their decisions, and how does it affect them as individuals? And is it possible to run as an electoral candidate in Indonesia and come out the other end of that process unscathed with your sense of identity and morals still, intact? And what kind of impact does going through a campaign as a candidate have on people and their view of the world? So it was a really exciting opportunity to kind of think about these questions in a more nuanced way. Oops. So I redrafted the book, looking at these individual journeys, and I kind of imagined it as the path to the National Parliament building in Jakarta. And, some of those candidates would get there, would get to the parliament, and others wouldn't. I should mention that the people on the posters here are not the people that I followed. These are just some campaign posters photos of campaign posters that I accumulated along the way. I began the book with this consideration of candidates who want to present themselves as anti-corruption fighters and figures, and who want to rally against money politics, and use this kind of as a starting point for tracing what happened within their campaigns. And I really found that with this finer focus on the struggle of individuals, it became much more, there was much more opportunity to unpack the tensions that exist between performance and practice and principles within a campaign, particularly against this backdrop where money politics and vote buying is fairly common. I also found that looking at individuals' election journeys really highlighted particular aspects of the campaigns that I hadn't really seen much of in other academic writing about elections in Indonesia. In particular, the role of identity and values within a campaign and how they translate into behavior, how campaigns change over time and what affects those changes, and also the personal toll that competing for public office can take on people. It's a really stressful, intense environment that people go through when they want to become politicians. The process is, very, can be very convoluted. The pressures that they face when they go out to meet voters can be very palpable. So it does take a toll on people's, emotional state, their sense of identity, where they feel, how they feel mentally about things. So there are all of these kinds of issues that I'm now having an opportunity to think about as I go back to my data. One of the points that I argue in the book is that the behavior of candidates is not an automatic response to the political landscape or the political context that they find themselves in. So, it's important to understand the systemic factors that influence candidate behavior. I think we also need to be very careful about generalizing candidate behavior and making assumptions about what people are going to do in certain situations. And this particular project and this pivot also gave me an opportunity to think about the things that I'd observed during my fieldwork through that lens, and, you know, ask some possibly more meaningful questions, I guess. You know, how are people shaped as subjects, and how do they understand themselves in particular ways, and how do they demonstrate that understanding through their decisions and actions? And, you know, another question that was kind of interesting to me was, you know, on what basis at different times and in different places do particular aspects of somebody's identity come out? And, you know, what can we say about the fluidity of identity as candidates move from different spaces? Are they saying the same thing to every single audience that they encounter? Probably not. So, you know, how are they making decisions about what particular aspects of their personality and identity they're going to highlight at a particular point in time? So I'm just putting the book synopsis up here because I can't talk too much more about the book, but this is essentially what it's about. This is what's on the back of the jacket cover. But I want to spend the rest of this talk focusing on two particular themes through my study. Firstly, positionality, and then a little bit on temporality within campaigns, and sort of relating that back to the individual experience and centering that experience within this study. So this is a quote from the book. A focus on individual experiences through a lens of positionality and temporality allows us to consider a person's actions, motivations, and reflections in all their complexity. It allows us the grace to consider that rationales and motivations are not fixed, and justifications can change from one moment to another. It allows us to understand inconsistency not as a human flaw, but simply as a normal human trait. So, for example, with one of my candidates, I recall very vividly trying to understand why he sometimes gave different explanations for why he would give voters small amounts of money sometimes when he met them. So he gave various justifications at different times. At one point, he described it as a token. Another time, he described it as a cultural expectation. You know, this is something that we do in our culture. Another time, he described it as being a reimbursement. So in giving that small amount of money to people, he's reimbursing them for their time and, you know, any costs that they might have encountered in coming to his rally or in coming to his meeting. So in Indonesia, they often refer to that as uang transport, money for transportation. And another time, he explained it as being sharing benefits from his position. So, you know, giving these small amounts of money to people was an opportunity for him to demonstrate that, you know, him being elected is going to have a tangible benefit for them. They're going to feel the impact of that. And so, you know, voting him in again is going to be beneficial to them. So right there, you have different justifications being given for this transaction, what is essentially a transaction, giving of money. It's being explained in terms of culture. It's being explained in terms of a responsibility, as being, you know, a pragmatic kind of reimbursement, as a sort of symbol of, you know, a demonstration of his success and his, you know, sort of flow-on benefits for other people in the community. And, you know, for a long time, I really struggled with this. You know, I had this idea that only one of these reasons could be the real reason for why he was giving money to people. And, you know, taking the step back and taking this more sort of individualized and sort of candidate-centric perspective, it really allowed me to let go of that thinking and to, recognize that it could be all of those reasons. It could be, one of those reasons at a particular point in time, and it could shift to a different reason depending on the context, depending on when I'd asked the question, depending on what had happened that day. Another example of how positionality shaped candidate campaigns really came through quite strongly in another case that I looked at. So there was a woman who in the book is called IU. They're all synonyms, not synonyms, sorry, they're all fake names. So this candidate, IU, she was in a really difficult situation. She started her campaign with this very idealized view of what she was going to do. She was, at the beginning of her campaign, very committed to not engaging in vote buying. She really saw herself as being a different kind of candidate, a candidate that wouldn't, stoop to the kind of behavior that other candidates might. And she was also a very strong supporter of the presidential candidate that her party was putting forward. So as she was starting out her campaign, she kind of saw her campaign as a reflection of the integrity and cleanliness, of the presidential candidate as well. So she kind of set herself up in this very sort of moral, anti-corruption sort of driven campaign at the beginning. But, as the campaign wore on, cracks started to form in this plan. And there are a couple of different things about her particular situation that made it really difficult for her to execute a campaign along those lines. She had chosen to run in a part of the country in Java where she had familial ties, but she hadn't actually grown up there herself. And it was very clear to me in observing the way that people related to her, that people sort of spoke to her, that they didn't see her as being one of them, even though she thought that she was one of them. So that became a really big sticking point for her campaign, because she wasn't really able to convince people that she was, a good local candidate that would represent their interests, because they saw her basically as a foreigner, somebody from Jakarta who doesn't understand what's happening in our district. And, as she started to realize that she wasn't getting the support that she had hoped for, that started to affect the decisions that she was making about her political campaign, to the extent that even though she had started from a point where she had, stated she would absolutely not buy votes or do any kinds of engagement with money politics, by the end of her campaign, her approach to the election had changed quite dramatically, to the extent that she was spending a lot of money, which she hadn't intended to do at the beginning. And a lot of that was to do with the fact that she couldn't quite get people to accept her as being one of them. One of the other candidates that I look at in the book was almost the complete opposite of that. So that's Ambo. He had a very different set of circumstances, and his was a case where his positionality absolutely allowed him, I think, to develop and maintain a campaign that didn't rely on money politics or vote buying. So for him, the particular electoral district that he was running in, he was from the right ethnicity, he was from the right gender, he was from the right religion, he had, good social class standing, He had good education status. He had strong backing from his political party. And it was all of these things that gave him the opportunity to run a campaign that didn't rely on money. And that opportunity is not afforded to everybody in Indonesia. To give you another example of, oh, sorry, I'm running out of time. Sorry, Mark, I'm going to try and wrap it up soon. To give you another example of some of the thinking around temporality, in my book, I've just got a little figure there. What it's trying to do is display a typology of different types of candidates and their approach to using anti-corruption messaging and symbolism within their campaigns, and kind of tracking that against, how they feel about money politics. Do they reject it completely? Do they accept it? Do they integrate it into their campaigns? Or do they kind of reluctantly acquiesce, like the candidate that I was talking about previously, who started off very idealistic, but then eventually kind of ended up using money in her campaign. And I won't go into too many details about that particular typology, but one of the things that I kind of reflect on in the book is that I put this typology together, but it's actually not very enlightening. It's very rudimentary. It doesn't tell us a lot about, like, trying to fit people into particular categories doesn't really tell us a lot about the campaigns. The more interesting question is thinking about what might move somebody from one of these quadrants to another quadrant. What might compel a candidate to change their position on money politics, or to change their position on using anti-corruption messaging in their campaigns, and using that line of questioning to understand behavior and how individuals and their context shape the way that campaigns play out in Indonesia. I don't have too much longer, Mark. So I want to finish by just reflecting on where the researcher fits into all of this, and more specifically where I think I fit into all of this. So that's me at a Gerindra rally in Surabaya with Prabowo. I don't include this picture to vocalize any kind of support or endorsement for Prabowo or Gerindra, just to demonstrate that I think to undertake a project like this, you need to have a bit of a sense of humor, because it is long days in the field and a lot of travel. And so keeping a bit of lightheartedness about you as you go through an extended ethnography like this is very important. But to get back to the talk, a lot of people have commented to me that they found the study really unique. It's a unique approach to thinking about political campaigns in Indonesia. And it's been said to me enough times that I've kind of, started reflecting a lot more on, how I shaped the research just by virtue of who I am, really. And of course, as with anything, your appearance, your language skills, your age, your education, your class are going to open certain doors to you and close others to you. And I think that was very clear to me during my project, that, there were some people who I was able to get access to, and it was not that difficult. There were other people who I would never have been able to get access to, even if I'd, spent 14 months trying. One very clear example to me was the role of my personal heritage. So my mother is Batak. Batak is an ethnic group based largely in the north of Sumatra. And I didn't grow up with Batak culture. I grew up in Jakarta. My mother didn't really educate me a lot on the intricacies of the kinship networks, but I have a passing understanding of what tribe I'm from, what marga I'm from, and how, bigger clans are interconnected with other clans Never in a million years did I imagine that this would influence my fieldwork, but it absolutely did. It was pivotal to my fieldwork. One of the candidates who I ended up shadowing is also Batak. And upon finding out my clan, my tribe, he almost instantaneously became more relaxed with me, which was very strange to me because I had never identified firstly as Batak or necessarily as being from that tribe, but for him it was a particular marker of who I was, how trustworthy I would be, how I would, understand the kinds of things that he was saying and doing. And, we kind of almost developed this big brother, younger sister relationship as we were going through, as I was sort of shadowing him through his campaign, to the extent that, he would joke about needing to educate me about Batak culture. And, we went to a Batak funeral and he was explaining to me all of these different aspects of the funeral. And we went to a wedding and he was explaining all of these different aspects of the Batak wedding to me. And it didn't really hit me at the time, just how important that particular aspect of my own identity and positionality was in gaining access. But now looking back on it, it was absolutely pivotal to that access that I had. And so, just by virtue of who we are, like, that has nothing to do with any learned skill that I have. It's just my heritage, a particular door opened to me that might not have been available to somebody with a different kind of positionality or identity. Similarly, with another candidate, Ayu, I think she really craved having somebody around her to whom she could vent about men, really. She had some issues with some of the male leadership within her party. She felt like she was being rejected by a lot of the village heads that she was meeting with, who were mostly men. And so I think she felt like she could complain to me about these sort of gendered barriers that she was facing in her campaign. And I don't imagine that that opportunity would have been there if I hadn't been a woman. And, again, I have no control over that. That's just who I am. And that happened to shape the access that I have. Now, this is my final slide. This is my absolute favorite picture from my fieldwork. It's taken with a marching band that performed at one of the campaign rallies that I attended. That's me on the right, on the left, and on the right, the boulet, the white guy, is my father. So he came with me in the final weeks of the campaign, basically as a voluntary research assistant, taking notes for me and photos. He's also got an interest in Indonesian politics and he speaks Indonesian, so it was fantastic. Who's going to say no to a free RA? But besides having my dad come with me on the campaign, which is quite fun, it was actually also really eye-opening to have him there because, I hadn't really thought about these things when I was there on my own, but I noticed when he was around, he attracted attention. No matter where he did, if he walked into a room, everybody would follow him. He couldn't move through the campaign space unnoticed. When we went to meetings, senior officials would make a beeline to shake his hand, to introduce themselves to him, to ask him questions. And this was absolutely not the experience that I had during fieldwork up till then. I'd spent months, trying my best to blend into the background, to keep a low profile, to just try and observe, to sort of dress in a way that people might think I was, a part of the campaign team or maybe a journalist or a researcher. And, as long as I didn't open my mouth, because I have a very strange Indonesian accent, I think I could pass. But it was just really interesting to see the different ways that people related to me and the way that they related to my dad, who physically looks very different from me, obviously a lot older than me. He's got grey hair. And, you know, it just kind of prompted me to think about, you know, what kinds of opportunities did I miss just because of what I look like? What kinds of opportunities would be open to him because of what he looks like? And, you know, I think it was really a reminder to me that, you know, as researchers, we're not neutral. We're not objective beings that move through the world and can just observe without having any impact. We actually shape the world that we move through, and people respond to us. They might respond to us overtly by, you know, wanting to introduce themselves, wanting to say hello, or it might be a silent response that we don't quite clock when we go into these spaces. But, you know, I think people saying that, you know, this research is unique. I mean, of course it's unique because I'm unique, just as any other researcher conducting a study, you know, your project would also be unique. And I think this really calls for us as researchers to be very cognizant of our own positionality and subjectivity, and to embrace it. You know, it's not something to be overcome or to be mitigated, but it's something that we need to be really aware of and to embed in our approach to research. And I've finished there. Sorry if I went over time.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth, for that fascinating and reflective talk. I think we all appreciate your giving us not just a perspective on Indonesian politics, but also how your own story fits into that, and also your dad's entry into the story at the end. Fascinating. I had my parents visit me when I was doing some research for my PhD, but never got them involved in my research. Who knows what would have happened if I had.
Yeah, I mean, his camera was much better than mine as well. So it was really nice having him along in those final sort of days when all the colors are out. So,
well, as I mentioned, we have plenty of time for questions, and I think as I mentioned to Elizabeth, I think I'll abuse my privilege here as chair of this session to start off. So Elizabeth, what I wanted to ask about is, and it's a little bit beyond what you were speaking to, but surely it's also an issue that you've looked into, and that is the issue of vote buying more generally. And you know, there is a literature on this in the rest of the region. I'm most familiar with the literature on the Philippines, and I know you were looking at the candidate's perspective, but I'm fascinated by this assumption that vote buying is corruption. So that was my first question. In what sense is that corrupt, particularly when candidates tell stories that are somewhat similar to what is often said about the vote buying in the Philippines, that it's seen as an acknowledgement of, you know, people's worth, a recompense for their expenses coming to the rally. That's another common statement. It's a recognition of their being taken seriously, and most voters, at least in the discussions in the Philippines, will deny that influences actually how they vote, which leads me to my second question. So what is the actual utility of vote buying, particularly for candidates who seem not to fit in, like the female candidate you mentioned, who you treat these candidates with pseudonyms, but hi, Diego's just joined us. So you know, did that help her? Is vote buying something that helps? And my final, if I can tack on just a final question, since you were interested in both local and national elections, in the Philippine context, it's often said vote buying is essential locally, but not that helpful nationally. The national candidates can't rely on vote buying. You can't buy yourself the presidency, for example. I'm wondering if you see similar, if you can comment on that in the situation in Indonesia. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try and remember all of those. Okay, so the first question is vote buying corruption. Is that essentially the question?
Yeah, as perceived by the candidates and their voters, potential voters.
So I think firstly, I do actually unpack this a little bit in the book because I think it is quite a grey area. I don't think that we can necessarily say vote buying is corruption, but then it also depends on what your definition of corruption is. So for me, I kind of conflate them, and actually in the book I conflate them, and I guess, you know, I sort of finished this draft 2020, and if I could go back and rewrite it, I would actually probably want to delve into that a little bit more because I don't think I did it justice in the book. I think that's actually a really complicated question because there's sort of a train of events that need to happen that connect vote buying to corruption. It doesn't always happen that way. So what do I mean? I guess the general discourse is that if you are spending a lot of money in your campaign, buying votes, for example, that's a huge capital outlay, and that will then make you more likely to be corrupt if you win once you're in Parliament, because you've got costs to recoup. Now, I didn't study that phenomenon in my research, so that's a general discourse that's out there that I think a lot of people, you know, think is true. But, you know, I guess if this research has taught me anything, generalizing that relationship is probably something that we need to be a little bit careful about. Maybe not everybody who buys votes is going to end up being super corrupt when they get into Parliament. Maybe people who don't buy votes will end up being corrupt when they get into Parliament. So that relationship, although it seems to be like the dominant discourse, I think is actually quite tenuous. I think a more clear way of thinking about it is more corruption in the sense of what is corruption when we talk about morality and right and wrong. And if we're thinking about vote buying, being able to spend money, however you spend it, whether it's cash or, you know, huge advertisements or whatever, that's going to give you an unfair advantage over the person who doesn't have that kind of money to splash around. And if we're thinking about corruption in terms of morality, corruptions in terms of justice, corruption in terms of like, what is the democratic process? How are we going to get the best possible people into Parliament to represent, you know, the voters and the citizens? Then I think that link between vote buying and corruption actually becomes a lot clearer. The third thing that I will say is that if we're thinking about corruption in terms of illegality, vote buying is clearly illegal. You know, the electoral laws are very clear about transactions related to trying to persuade voters to use their votes in certain ways. So yeah, I think your question is, I'm not sure if I've really answered it. I probably rambled a little bit, but I think it's a complicated one. And I don't necessarily think that vote buying is corruption, but I think that there are ways to explain it as being corruption if you take, you know, a certain perspective on corruption or a certain definition of corruption. The utility of vote buying, I should say, one of those books that came out, the one by Burhanuddin Muhtadi, actually deals specifically with this question. And it's an excellent book. I'm trying to remember what it's called. I think it's called Vote Buying in Indonesia. But I mean, his argument is that no, vote buying doesn't necessarily influence electoral outcomes. And he also argues that it's not as prevalent as we might think it is. I mean, I will say that in the 3 districts that I was in, it was certainly something that was discussed and something that I either saw firsthand or heard about. But, you know, that's only 3 districts out of, you know, several hundred. So who knows? But I think the argument that's often put forward, I think, was sort of articulated really well by Tom Power, that using money in election is not necessarily going to give you, victory, but it's going to get you through the door. If you don't give people anything, you will get, you're very unlikely to have any chance of winning. But, if you can give them something, then that is at least your entry ticket into the electoral race. Again, that's not the phenomenon that I was looking at in my research, but I think that the utility of vote buying is actually, I think that the general sort of research that I've seen and discussion is that it's not playing as big a role as you would think. I'm just trying to think about what I saw when I was doing my research. I mean, I definitely remember one of the candidates, he would go out to his rallies and he would say to people, take all the money. If anyone offers you money, just take it. Take it and choose whoever you want. I don't feel like taking money from somebody is necessarily a promise to them or a commitment to them. If they're silly enough to offer you money, take it. So I think, he was very sort of cognizant that it was happening. He was campaigning against it. But I think, the utility of it is probably best answered by other research studies, I think. And the last question was about.
I just was wondering if you noticed local versus national variations of that.
In
the
by
issue of vote buying.
votes?
Yeah.
I mean, I think from what I observed, money politics, vote buying may play a role, but I think identity plays a much, much bigger role. So the two candidates that I observed who were successful were very much playing into the Putra Dayata phenomenon that you have in Indonesia, which is, possibly the same in the Philippines as well. That literally translates to son of the soil. So somebody who is from the region, speaks the language, has personal connections and family connections in the region, can really kind of leverage that identity to present themselves as being, a true representative of the people in that region in a way that somebody from the outside can't. Having said that, I mean, I think there are a lot of stories, particularly from the bigger parties like Golkar, of people who are essentially based in Jakarta who send, their staffers out to give people envelopes and I think some of them still win. There was actually a really interesting case, which I didn't study for this project, but of a sitting DPR member who lived in Sydney and was voted into office in Riau, I think, but was actually living in Sydney. I'm pretty sure he was a permanent resident here. I'm not sure whether he, how often he was going into Parliament. I don't know what commission he was on, but I don't think that he was a particularly active campaigner when he went to run for office. So I suspect that, he may have also had some staffers go out and give out some money to that. I think he was somewhere in the south of Sumatra. So yeah, there are anecdotes and stories about that. But I think you're right in saying I don't think that money will ever buy the presidency for somebody. And as we've seen, the presidential rumblings are already starting in Indonesia, even though the election is 2 years away.
Thanks very much. The floor is open for anybody else who wants to jump in.
Mark, can I ask a question? You hear me?
We can hear you, Diego.
Okay, Elizabeth, great to hear from you. Sorry I wasn't able to join earlier for other commitments. So I hope I'm not like asking a question that has been addressed already in your talk, but hearing you answer those questions, like you made reference to this big issue in Indonesian politics, both local and national. It's not unique of Indonesia, of course, that we are facing like very high costs of politics. Politics is expensive with or without corruption, and of course there are a lot of candidates who may be worthy and civic-minded, but they just don't have access to this kind of like financial capital. So I was just wondering, like, generally, how you feel about possible institutional, like, political reforms that might mitigate this kind of problem. Like, many have advocated, for example, a reform of political finance that made like substantial amount of public funding available for candidates. I was just curious, like, since you're such an expert of this topic, what your thoughts of it on it are.
On institutional reform. Yeah, and I mean, I think you're referring to, is it Marcus Mutino, who's written
Yes,
quite a bit on reforming party financing by the state.
It's also
in
an
Indonesia.
argument we often hear, like, outside the Indonesian context, right? That we think that making this kind of resources available through the state can address this kind of inequalities. Based on what you have learned in your field work and what you see, can it work in the Indonesian context?
I mean, theoretically, it's possible. I think anything's theoretically possible, if you put it that way. And I think, I mean, one of the things that I do think could help to improve the situation in Indonesia would be for political parties to be held more accountable for the actions of their individual candidates. So, you know, in the last set of elections in 2019, you did see a few people being prosecuted for vote buying in elections, but, you know, it's really not a large amount of people, and probably compared to the number of people who actually engage in that kind of behavior, it's a drop in the ocean. So I think trying to regulate this kind of behavior through the courts, through prosecuting individuals, is just not feasible in the Indonesian context. So if you're looking at other alternatives to that, I think holding parties accountable for the actions of their candidates is probably the only practical way that you could really address vote buying as a specific phenomenon. I know you're asking more about money politics more generally. But of course, the issue is that the people who make these rules are from the political parties. And so expecting them to self-regulate in a way that's going to potentially limit what they can and can't do is a really big ask, not just in Indonesia, anywhere. And particularly when you have the larger parties that have you know, more resources at their disposal, it's not in their interests to put in, you know, stricter sort of, not stricter regulations, but to actually better implement the regulations that already exist. Now, there are smaller parties that would be campaigning for this because it would be beneficial for them to have tighter restrictions on campaign financing, particularly from private or, you know, non-state sources. But they're not the ones who have the majority in parliament. They're not the ones who have, you know, the big voices in the national, you know, different commissions. So it's this really tough situation where the people who need to be regulated are the ones who are making the regulation. And I mean, I think the way that things are right now, I don't see this, I kind of see this as an intractable problem right now. Something could change. I mean, of course, we all hope that something would change so that that could be addressed in the future. I suppose campaign financing, I think theoretically, if it was better regulated by the state and parties had, you know, a more sort of not equal access, but a more equitable kind of access to funding, that could potentially make the playing field a little bit more level. But again, you know, imagining PDIP, Golkar, Democrats committing to something like that is difficult to imagine at this point in time.
Thank you.
If there
Are there any?
like everybody's being very quiet, but you know, I don't want to keep people if they've got dinners to get to. So I'm happy to.
There's a question in the chat.
Oh, I can't see the chat, sorry.
I think it's about, it says it's interesting to know that Indonesia is considering to change the legislative election, the electoral system to closed proportional system. So another question on possible institutional reform. A lot of, especially in the Indonesian context, we often think of open list, the reform implemented in 2009 as a source of many of the problems that you have described, and the prevalence of personalistic / clientelistic appeals. Do you see any prospects for this
reversing that?
Do you see any prospect for, you know, maybe a return to the closed list?
I mean, well, I mean, I suppose it could be proposed, but constitutionally, I mean, if the Constitutional Court has already ruled on it as a matter of, you know, something embedded in the Constitution, it's difficult to see that being rolled back. I suppose, you know, if no, I mean, I can't see that being reversed. And I mean, to the question that's in the chat, you know, changes to the political system, you know, generally, whether, I mean, one of the things that seems to come up again and again in parliaments is the quota threshold for being able to nominate a presidential candidate. And, you know, consistently you see the bigger parties pushing for and supporting legislation that basically serves their interests and cuts smaller parties out of that that particular race, or at least like forces them to form coalitions and not be able to put forward presidential candidates on their own. So, I mean, I would be very suspicious of one of the bigger parties in Parliament putting forward a particular change to the legislative processes. I think that self-interest seems to guide most of the decisions that happen. You know, if you look at, you know, changes to the KPK, you know, changes to the omnibus law, I mean, I really think that you would have to be very suspicious if you know, there's a party that's pushing for these particular changes. You know, how are they going to benefit from them?
Right.
I think, just to add, I think it's great because I noticed we have a few PhD students in the audience, so it's nice to hear a happy ending story.
Yeah.
All's well that ends well. The
All's
PhD
well that-
process is such,
Also, with the benefit of hindsight, all's well.
well, indeed,
as well.
it's such a grind, and to have such a challenge facing you with the publication. But it is interesting how I think that shows you're by nature an optimistic person. See, that is a good thing that reviewers made these suggestions. The editor came back with this, and I think a lot of us have encountered that very tough critiques on whatever we submit, and then in hindsight realized, well, quite useful actually. But it's time consuming.
Definitely been one of those learning
it's a
processes. I feel like my skin grows thicker, every month.
Well, it's the
in
kind
academia.
of the kind of aspect of academics most people maybe don't understand. Also, indeed, quite a bit of resilience to being able to take in that kind of criticism and try to use it constructively. So thanks for that. That's very useful. I think inspirational, perhaps even. I'm sure, Diego, you didn't struggle with your PhD, so you're accepted, but others may have.
I didn't struggle. Sorry. Apologies. I did not struggle not getting my PhD thesis published. I just didn't. It's never become the book.
Okay. Well, that's one way to deal with the issue.
Yes, I had
To be
to.
fair, you've published others, so that makes up for it.
Project, and finally, though, it did actually just this week. I received the first copies of.
Wow! Congratulations.
So it felt good.
Oh, wait! Copies of a book? Oh, congratulations! Oh, but wait, bring it closer. I can't see.
I can see myself actually. I can see my myself in the camera. So.
Okay. Oh yeah. Oh, fantastic! Congratulations.
Thank you. And
I know how hard it can be.
As Elizabeth knows, I'm sure it feels very good to finally be able to touch the real thing after so many months of labor.
I'm sure ethnographers of a future age will look back that in this internet age we still like the book. They still love the book.
Exactly.
I mean, there was a point, I think last year, where I was just thinking about, all of the PhD students who, had planned to do ethnography in 2020, 2021, who just, couldn't go anywhere, were in lockdowns, or, at least like had their ability to travel severely restricted. And, I was just like, gosh, if something like that had have happened during my PhD, it would be, this book would have never existed. I mean, it was so deeply premised on being mobile and just being able to go to these places that, just the sort of curtailing of travel, just, there are so many PhD students who've probably really struggled over the last 2 years trying to pivot their projects, and, particularly in anthropology and those fields where, there's sort of this connection that you develop with your field sites and your subjects. And I mean, if there are any PhD students in the audience, you've